Tonight, I wanted to talk about this idea of loving our ego into wholeness. And so we've been talking a lot about healing our wounds, healing our inner child, breaking out of unproductive patterns. And that's all great stuff, all very important stuff. But sometimes if you've been working on that for a while, you might start to notice that it gets harder to make progress after a while. So when we first start on this healing journey, it can often seem like we're making big leaps and bounds, healing things, healing wounds that have been there for a while, feeling new parts of ourselves, letting ourselves feel new ways, feel different things. But after a while, the progress might kind of feel like it's leveling out. It might seem like it's getting harder to keep healing wounds, or there's some wounds that are just really hard to heal, really stuck in there deep. Seems like no matter how much we love on them, we can't quite heal those wounds, can't quite heal that pain that's deep inside. And sometimes this is because the ego can sometimes start to create an identity around the actual act of healing the wounds. Or in other cases, so sometimes just the ego starts to identify itself as something that is healing wounds. And so if the ego, if we heal all the wounds, then there's nothing left for the ego to do. The ego can start to, because the ego needs a job, it needs a project, because that's what the ego is. It evolved as a problem solving apparatus that evolved within us to help us survive the challenges of living as a early modern human, when we were fighting on the Serengeti, trying to survive, trying to fight to get enough food, trying to avoid predators, trying to work with our tribe. So when our brains evolved, when the ego evolved, there were lots of challenges that needed to be solved. And the ego evolved as a way to solve these challenges, solve these problems in order to keep us alive. But now that most of us live in an environment where we don't need to solve problems to survive, the ego starts figuring out, or starts coming up with other things that it constantly needs to be working on to solve. The ego starts finding other problems to fix, other problems to obsess about, that it needs to constantly work on to fix. And if there's, to the ego, the idea of not having any problems, not having anything to work on, not having anything to do, that can be a little bit threatening to the ego. And so sometimes the ego will subconsciously hold on to wounds, or hold on to bad habits, just because the ego feels like it needs something to do. The ego feels like it needs something to justify its existence. And so that's one reason why it can be difficult to heal some of these wounds to completion. And another reason is that sometimes the ego starts to identify itself, create an identity around having the wound itself. So, for example, say if your entire life you've had a troubling relationship with your mother, your ego might start to define itself as based on this troubling relationship with your mother. And the ego doesn't know who it is without having this defining factor. And so that's another way the ego might subconsciously hold on to a wound because it doesn't know who it is without this wound. And so these are just a couple ways that the ego, despite its best intentions, can sometimes get in our way. And it's not the it's not, the ego is not evil. It's not trying to do this. It's not trying to sabotage us. It's not trying to draw out our suffering, or it doesn't know any better. And so this is where some practices of mindfulness and our self-love practices can help quiet the ego, quite calm it down. So a lot of the traditional spiritual approaches focused mostly on just calming the ego and trying to still it, just trying to bring it to a place of peace. And that's one way to approach it, and that works sometimes. But as we've been talking about here, another way to approach that is to give the ego love. So if the ego wants something to fixate on, you can lead it to fixate on love instead. If just trying to if going to stillness is too big of a jump, we can take a stepping point through focusing on love before we, maybe as a waypoint, before we get to being totally quiet, totally silent in the mind. If that's indeed something that you want to work towards, maybe you don't want to. There's no need to work towards stillness. Love is a pretty good place to work towards. And so we'll do an exercise later on tonight, working on giving some love directly to the ego in order to help quiet the ego, settle down. And maybe it could be some way to help to resolve some of these wounds and unproductive patterns that we're holding on to. And so I think that's all I have to say about that for now. Are there any questions or comments on that topic? Does that make sense?